So Roger had two parts to his question. And the first one was, he says the book does not cover reincarnation and the journey of souls. That's not quite accurate. In chapter 2, from pages 18 to 23, we actually talked about reincarnation, and then we devoted 4 pages to near-death experiences and another 3 pages to life between lives. So we actually, at the very beginning of the book in chapter 2, dealt with it fairly significantly. So if you want to kind of just brush up on that, there's basically, if you read from pages 14 to 25, you'll get a good synopsis of it. But just to add a few remarks, because for me, reincarnation is a primary teaching. It's one of the most important teachings of all. And certainly for me, when I had my first reincarnational experience, which was in 1987, it radically changed my personal cosmology. And what I got is that there is no way that we can grok Earth life from playing one role one time round. So the soul needs a kind of a cumulative learning or growth process. So to use a kind of an analogy, you can't know Shakespeare by just reading one of his sonnets, or you can't know the mindset of Shakespeare if you just read one of his plays and played a role in one of the plays. If you played like Polonius in Hamlet, and you think then you understand the thinking of Shakespeare, you wouldn't have a clue who Shakespeare was. So it's the same thing. Each one of us is playing a single role in a lifetime. And I distinguish between 3 levels of role. There's the role self, where I'm playing a character called Seán in this incarnation. And then there's my soul self, which is the eternal being who was never born and will never die, but volunteered in this particular incarnation to play the role of an Irish guy. And then there's the source self, which is basically all of us once we let go of the kind of the illusions that we are separate from God. And so when we properly understand reincarnation, then it is impossible to be prejudiced if I really understand reincarnation, because when I realized that I've been in all the other configurations, I've been male and female, gay and straight, I've had a genius IQ and I've been retarded, I've been physically disabled and I've been an athlete. I've been a very important person, maybe a politician in the past life, and I've been a beggar on the streets. And so it then becomes impossible to be prejudiced when you encounter any of these other people. And so from the point of view of sociology, of theology, and of psychology and spirituality, I can't think of a more important teaching, than the notion of reincarnation. So that's just what I'd say about it tonight. Obviously, I've spent probably over 100 homilies throughout the last 35 years in Palo Alto, speaking about reincarnation in various kinds. So there's a treasure trove of that material, my ideas on it at least, on the website. The second part of Roger's question was the role of evil in our evolution. Please share your thoughts. Now, if I were to do an examination of the problem of evil, theology calls it the theodicy question, and it's the most troubling theological question there is. Every group and every era and every religion has tried to struggle with an understanding of it. So I'm not going to even attempt that tonight. I'll point you to, I devoted an entire retreat last year. The 2021 retreat was totally dedicated to the topic of evil in all its forms. And you can find that on my website. If you go onto the website and go to 2021 under homilies, there's a series of 6 lectures from March 15th to March 17th that goes into great detail about the origins of evil and the function of it. But I will pick up on that question of Roger's, what is evil's role in evolution? So I'm just going to focus on that one piece of it. The idea of evil itself is a huge, huge, huge topic. So I just focus in on one narrow element of it. Does evil have a role in the evolution of a soul? Now, I remember writing an article one time. In fact, I did a whole homily, but I have no idea where it is, which I called Temptation, the Royal Road to Enlightenment. So that's what I had to just to kind of rehash for a little bit tonight. So when I look at temptation, I see it has a dark side and it has a light side. So what is the dark side of temptation or evil? The dark side is that the more advanced you become as an individual, or the the greater a particular species is. You know, if you're talking about angelic beings, you're talking about extra-dimensionals or like extraterrestrials, the more advanced a civilization is, or the more advanced an individual person within the civilization is, then the greater our ability and the greater the temptation. So because advanced beings have free will, we can use this free will well, or we can use it badly. And so as we evolve as individuals, and as we evolve as a species, and as we encounter other species who are much more advanced than us, we come across two things: that they're much more advanced, and so they have far greater abilities, and they have far greater temptations. And so the ultimate kind of version of that was the notion that a being called, an angelic being called, we call him Satan, he was called Lucifer, which literally means the light bearer, that allegedly Lucifer, who was an angelic being of a very high order, used his willpower to rebel against God. And so the more advanced we are, if we have free will, the greater the power and the greater the temptation. So that's, in some senses, that's part of the dark side of the problem of evil, vis-a-vis our evolution. Now, ultimately, I see that all temptation is about an attempt to gain power and control of resources, of people, and of institutions. When you see, you know, power being vested and control being exercised over the resources, over the people, and over the institutions, you see a group of people who are kind of elevating themselves into they become the oligarchy, the governing body of particular kinds of institutions. And you find this in politics, you find it in religion, you find it in the mass media, you find it in finance, you find it in education, you find it in agriculture, you find it in medicine, and you find it in the military. And in fact, I gave a homily way back in 2010, you know, talking about, I said, something is rotten in the state of Denmark. And as a result, we set up an exploration group that went on for maybe 10 years, where we took each of these topics one by one per month, and we began to examine how is this topic or this resource being exercised in our world right now. So this is part of the temptation that comes with increased power or increased resources. So power corrupts, and infinite power corrupts infinitely. This was a statement that was actually made by an English noble called Lord Acton, who was, strangely enough, was a very, very staunch Catholic. But in 1870, when the First Vatican Council was called, and the Pope at the time, Pius IX, was trying to declare infallibility, which had never been a teaching of the Catholic Church for the first 1,870 years. And now he's trying to bring in a notion that the Pope, when he speaks ex cathedra on matters of faith and morals, is infallible. And Lord Acton, who was a very, very staunch Catholic, came up with that statement at this stage. He said, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So he was totally against the notion of papal infallibility. But we see it all over. You know, people who start off with great, you know, compassion in any industry or any kind of project, whether it's, you know, saving the whales or, you know, ecological green movements or whatever it is, almost inevitably, once they get the taste of power, they get corrupted and they forget who their constituency is, and then it goes to their head and they become tyrants at some stage. So it's interesting to me to watch that narcissistic megalomaniacs tend to rise and to self-promote to leadership positions in all kinds of governing bodies and in all hierarchical systems. Once you create a hierarchical systems, you're opening the way for narcissistic megalomaniacs to promote themselves into positions of power. So that's the dark side of temptation and how it affects the evolutionary trajectory. Now there's a light side as well, you know, to the problem of darkness. And so the great prophet and the great mystic and the great poet, Jalaluddin al-Rumi, said way back in 800 years ago, he said, out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I will meet you there. Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I will meet you there. And some 500 years later, Shakespeare came to the same conclusion. He said, there is nothing either good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. In other words, somehow we create these categories and we force all experiences into one of two buckets. It's either good or it's either bad. Now, my own position is that whoever Satan is, and I have no doubt, and I've given an entire retreat about my notion on Satan, whoever Satan is, we are meant, each one of us, to work with that reality in order to grow spiritually. And so the notion of darkness, is an extraordinary method and tool for actually growing spiritually. And so temptation is not just an invitation to evil, it is an opportunity to hone the faculty of discernment. In fact, the creator of the Jesuit order, Ignatius of Loyola, he had a special section in his spiritual exercises called De Discretione Spirituum, which means learning to discern among spirits. And all of his kind of spiritual directors, when he was training them, that this was their primary function, to learn to determine on any occasion when they were giving spiritual direction to people or on their own journey, to discern, to find out this temptation, how can it be used well or badly? How am I going to discern between the possibilities of it? And you look again and again and again, and all the great avatars, the Buddha figures, the Jesus figures, they're all have to undergo severe temptation before they begin their public ministries. And this is a final ditch effort by the dark side, either to prevent the mission or to derail the mission, because it doesn't just happen at the beginning, it happens throughout the ministry. And all the great figures will have to encounter it. And not only does it not defeat them or kind of obstruct the mission, it makes them more and more spiritual. And so there's a very important light side to evil. And that is for those who know how to handle it, discern it, and work with it, you become a more and more light-filled being by rejecting the temptations. Now, you can't hit the bullseye if you're firing an arrow at a target. You can't hit the bullseye unless you use the feedback from previous efforts in order to adjust your aim. And that's the function of temptation in a sense. It gives us a feedback mechanism to adjust our aim in our spiritual journeys or in any journey we're making. So without temptation, we would simply be robots pre-programmed to be good. And so, I created a kind of a matrix of a 2x2 matrix. Imagine, there's 2 rows and 2 columns. So you got 4 windows. And I people them in the following way. So one line is conscious, one is unconscious. One row is good, the other one is evil. The other row is evil. So you got 4 windows. And I people those in the following way, populate those in the following way. Somebody who's unconsciously good is simply lucky. Somebody who's unconsciously evil is simply asleep. Somebody who's consciously evil is pathological, and somebody who's consciously good is enlightened. And so that's all I have time for, obviously, to say about the issue of evil and its impact on the trajectory of our evolution. The second great question came from Kevin Skillen. And here's what Kevin asked. He said, we are currently working on chapter 12 and looking at our past 7-year cycles. As we look at our life experiences, it is important to bring meaning to our lives, and this contributes to our souls. Any comment? And so if you remember, one of the exercises that we proposed in this book called Why was the notion of, taking a sheet of paper and creating 4 columns, and then dividing each column into rows to break up your life into 7-year chunks, from 0 to 7, 7 to 14, 14 to 21, etc. And for each era in your life, to ask 4 questions, 3 questions of yourself. The first one is, who are the important people at that stage of my life? Second question is, what were the important events that happened to me in that period of my life? And then thirdly, what were the important lessons I learned from that period of my life? Now, it's quite easy, when you were going through each of them, you were aware of who the people were, you were aware of what the events were, but you may not necessarily have been aware of what the lessons were. So often it is only retroactively that you can go back and say, oh yeah, when I was between 7 and 14, these events happened, these were the people in my life, and now looking back, here's what I think the lesson may have been. So when you do that exercise, the really important piece is to harvest the lessons, because I guarantee you, you'll begin to see the same lessons repeating again and again and again from era to era to era. And we keep getting the same lesson until we've learned it. And then life will give us a different set of lessons. So unless we trawl and harvest the lessons of each stage of our lives, we're destined to keep repeating them indefinitely. So that's what I meant then by the notion of the 7-year cycles exercise. Now, Kevin's question then, how do you bring meaning out of that? So I want to kind of define what meaning is for me. Meaning is the aha, when we harvest our experiences for evidence of how well or badly we align with our mission. That would be my definition of meaning. Meaning is the aha experience, when we harvest our experiences for evidence of how well or badly we are aligned with the mission. Now, there are true meanings and there are false meanings, because meaning is in the mind of the seeker. So some of us will come to conclusions. We'll say, I understand now what the meaning of these particular lessons was. And I may be accurate, or I may be totally fooling myself. So it becomes really, really important then to exercise discernment and to be in dialogue with other people who are on the same kind of journey, that we can compare notes with each other, so that eventually I can learn what the true meaning of my own unique experiences might have been. And so on Sunday last, I was talking about memes and genes and archetypes and complexes and stories. So very, very briefly, what I said was that the archetype is the ideal form which gets manifested in a complex during incarnation. And I gave the example of a mother complex. And for many people, they tend to think that a complex is a hang-up, and it is not. A complex is simply a cluster of emotionally associated experiences around the archetype. So I'll give you an example then. There's an archetype of mother with which every neonate is born. Every infant comes in with the archetype of mother implanted on its psyche. It knows it's going to meet a woman, with breasts, nipple, milk, cuddling, loving words, that makes the child the center of her being. That's the archetype that's imprinted in the psyche of the child. Now the child comes in and is going to meet an actual mother who will always be less than perfect. Mother has other things to do. Mother may not be a very evolved creature herself. Mother may have other children. Mother may be working as well. And so now the little child is going to build up a whole bunch of actual experiences, emotionally associated, that cluster around the original archetype of mother. And this creates the mother complex. So the mother complex is are the cluster of experiences that coagulate around the archetype. Now, in that sense, then, meaning is about matching the complex to the archetype. So when you're attempting to salvage meaning from any experience, you have to try to compare what is the complex in your life right now around this particular issue, and what would be the archetype of this issue, and to see if you can bridge the gap between the complex and the archetype. So briefly, Kevin, that's what I would say about your question. Nancy Harris asked a bunch of really good questions. So here's one of them. She says, I believe in the concept of preconception contracts that the soul chooses as a way to learn and to grow in a particular lifetime. However, I have a hard time understanding why a soul would choose really horrible conditions, such as child sexual abuse, human trafficking, murder, torture, babies that die of starvation or abuse, etc. I even wonder why domesticated animals have to go through terrible abuse and neglect. Does that help their souls grow? What are your thoughts on this? And so it's a brilliant question. And again, it goes back to the issue of theodicy, or the problem of evil. So here are a few responses, Nancy. The first thing is, I believe that the preconception contract, whereby a group of souls, contract to come into life around the same time. Some of them will be grandparents, some of them will be parents, some will be siblings, some will be kind of friends, some of them will be children, perhaps, or grandchildren of your own. But there's a group that is coming in roughly at the same period. And by extension, everybody in the world at the same period of time, is part of that contract, although you have different levels of connection to them. but we're all here because we chose to be on the planet at this stage. Now, part of the preconception contract, I believe, is that it is a psychodrama. And psychodrama is a psychological technique where, if as a psychologist, I'm working, let's say, with 4 different clients, and each client has their own unique issue. But sometimes, in order to be able to kind of understand a client's personal issues, you have to be able to see them in relationships. And so sometimes I bring together a group, maybe say 4 people. You know, they don't know each other, never met each other before, but they agree to take part in this exercise. And I put them on stage, and I assign each of them a role and a kind of a starting story. So there are 4 people on stage. I said to one guy, you're the father of this family, and you're an engineer. You're the mother of this family, and you're, let's say, an artist, famous artist. You're the son in this family, and you're a jock. You're the high school quarterback, and everybody loves you. And you're the daughter in this family, and you've got a drug problem. And now the mother has just got a message from the school authorities that the daughter has been suspended for a week. And now you're meeting as a family for the first time. That's all you know about the situation. Now you've never met any of these 4 people on stage with you. All you've been given is a role, and you've been given a starting scenario. So what are you going to do with it? So obviously, you're going to draw on your previous experiences from your real life to make some kind of an intervention or a statement. If you're the mother, you're saying, what the hell were you thinking about? Or the father saying, you know, I can't believe, you know, I'm bursting my arse out, you know, earning for you guys, and this is what you do. So everybody's going to chip in, and they're going to reveal their own real character. And then the plot is going to evolve. And as it evolves, you get to see more and more of what each individual is actually like in situations of kind of conflict. And they're learning themselves. They're learning to see, oh my God, in this kind of situation, here's the part of me that came out. Now, I believe that the preconception contract is like that. There is no script and there is no plot. We came in here, you know, and we had previous histories, previous incarnations, and now it's kind of improv theater. So improv theater, the thing about improv theater is there are 2 main functions of improv theater. I had a client one time who was actually a professional actor, and his specialty was improv theater. And he said there are 2 rules to successful improv theater. The first one is you have to work with whatever line your partner offers you. If you're on stage with other actors and somebody, you know, gives a line or says something or does something, you have to say, that's a dumb thing to say, you know, I can't work with that, give me a different line. You have to work with whatever the other people on stage are offering you. That's the first rule. And the second rule is your job is to give everybody else lines that are going to make them look good. Your job is not to try to make yourself look good. Your job is to offer lines to everybody else that, you know, play to their strengths. And if they're doing the same thing for you, then the play really starts to take off and make strides. If everybody is out to kind of impress the audience with his own ability and is demeaning all the other actors, the play is going to flop immediately. So that for me is part of the preconception contract. So before we come in then, I think we know the following things. We know our own personal history. Each soul knows my previous incarnations, how I behaved, what my strengths are and what my weaknesses are. That's the first, I know that implicitly. Secondly, I know the history of all of the other players that are coming in with me. Everybody on the planet. Now, I'm going to forget all of that as soon as I come, of course. But before I come in, I'd be to, okay, I know what the scene is. I know the strengths and weaknesses of all the other characters. I know that completely. And I know what my mission is, what I'm signing up to do, which is basically to wake myself up fully, to help wake up others, and finally, to shift the consciousness of the planet. And the final piece of information we're given as we kind of parachute into incarnation, I believe, we're given our own secret, sacred name. There's a particular logos, there's a particular sound, there's a particular vibration, there's a specific, you know, word of God addressed to every single soul, which is meant to morph the soul into its mission. As I've said many times, that I call them the 5 L's. God is love. God births twins, light and logos. Light is the origin of all matter. All matter is simply frozen light. Logos, you know, is that faculty which forms matter, which forms, you know, creates form or morphology out of mere matter. It takes the same matter, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and it creates oak trees out of it, or kitty cats out of it, or human beings out of it. That's the function of logos. And then life is when light and logos dance together, they create the life trajectory. And the ultimate function and purpose of life is to learn how to laugh at the illusion that we're separate from God, that we're separate from each other, and that we're separate from nature. That at that stage, only laughter is possible, not derisive laughter, but the realizing, holy God, I can't believe, I lived under this illusion for so long, and that the world appears to be living under a similar illusion. And so the function of this secret sacred name is the logos creating a morphology for the soul to bring it into total alignment with its mission. So that's what I'd say about the preconception conflict, Nancy. The second part of your question then was, how can we best deal with or overcome dark forces and cabals, such as the World Economic Forum, WHO, etc., and many other power-grabbing entities that are designed to exert control over individual sovereignty and hence thwart us from fulfilling our individual mission or purpose? It's a great question. So here are some reflections on it. How to? The first one, I think, is to realize, and I've devoted several homilies to this topic, I call them the 4 C's, the 4 kinds of compassion. The first kind of compassion is confirmation, the attaboy, you've done a great job, keep it up, way to go. The second kind of compassion is cooperation. We're part of a team and everybody in the team has a different function. One person on the team is a quarterback, somebody else is a kind of wide receiver, but everybody in the team is equally important. Even the big, 400-pound guys who are just pushing each other around, every one of these have a function on the team. So the second kind of compassion is cooperation. The third kind of compassion is compensation. Somebody drops the ball, literally, and somebody else rushes in to try and pick it up, so there's not a turnover. And so again and again and again, we're called to try to help out when people make mistakes, and we all make mistakes. That's the third kind of compassion. And the fourth kind of compassion is confrontation. Somebody is really screwing up and continues to screw up and refuses to be part of the team and is getting in the way of everybody else. The coach is going to call that guy ashore and say, we're substituting you right now. And so realizing what is the appropriate kind of compassion in what circumstances. And so most of the time I go by the 80-20 rule. In all of my homilies and my lecturing, I attempt to do an 80-20 split. That 80% of the time, I'm trying to be inspirational and esoteric and mystical in what I offer. And 20% of the time, I'm being confrontational because I'm going to challenge, the crap that I see wherever I see it in the world or whatever. And so we have to try to balance, what is the appropriate response in this situation. But whatever is coming out of it cannot come out of anger. It can come out of compassion, but compassion can be confrontational, really strong. You look at how Jesus confronts the Pharisees. You look at how Buddha, confronted the priests, the Brahmin caste of his time. You look at how Nelson Mandela confronted apartheid. You look at how Martin Luther King Jr. confronted racism in the country. And so there has to be passion behind it, but it can't be coming out of anger. That's the second piece I'd say. And I would say then that a single bulb can dispel a room full of darkness. One single bulb can dispel a room full of darkness. And the opposite is not true. One dark spot cannot suck all the light out of a room, but one bulb can suck all the darkness out of a room. And in fact, I would say that a battery of bulbs can dispel a warehouse full of darkness. But again, the opposite is not true. A battery of dark spots will not dispel a light-filled warehouse. So this becomes really, really important. That it appears that often that the light beings are radically outnumbered, but it only takes a single light being to light up an entire environment or an entire culture. A Jesus figure, a Buddha figure, a Mahatma Gandhi figure, a Mother Teresa figure. Now, this is why Jesus would say, don't hide your light under a bushel measure, because the greatest weapon the dark forces have is either to persuade or to threaten the masses to turn off their lights or to hide their lights. And so what I see is that those who choose to live under the radar will soon be living under the jackboot. Those who are willing to trade the responsibilities of freedom for the security of tyranny are hiding their light, and then there is no way of dispelling the darkness. So it becomes really, really important to let your light shine. So that's how I'd respond to the second part of your question. There was a third part of your question, Nancy, which is really good as well. Here's what you said. I get it that meditation, prayer, waking up, and taking aligned action is important here. Is that enough? Do you believe divine intervention of some kind may help us with what we are currently facing and dealing with? So when I think about that, then it seems to me that when you use the phrase divine intervention, it brings up three possibilities for me. So a divine intervention could be actually activating the God within ourselves. If every single one of us is built in the image and likeness of God, then one kind of divine intervention is simply activating the God within us. So it means waking up to who you really are. That's one kind of divine intervention. A second kind of divine intervention would be imploring assistance from the God within more enlightened beings than you or me. And so imploring assistance from, for instance, angelic beings, or extraterrestrials, or extra-dimensionals. So that would be a second way of, of a divine intervention. And a third way would be some kind of direct intervention from source itself. So when we think then about a divine intervention, there's either awakening the God within myself, imploring assistance from the God within more evolved beings than me, more evolved species than human beings, and then thirdly, hoping that God herself would step in. Now, I want to use a kind of an analogy here. I want you to imagine that you're a parent at home looking out through your kitchen window, and there's a group of kids playing out in the backyard, your kids and a bunch of neighboring kids. There's maybe 10 or 12 kids playing in the backyard. Now, they need to learn how to interact as children with each other in order to learn the skills of relationship and even to sustain minor injuries, either physical or even mental, in order to learn how to grow, and roll with the punches. But if you see the children, and you're not going to intervene, if you're a good parent, you're going to let them learn their lessons, as long as they're not any kind of major damage. If you see there's any kind of danger of major injury, you're going to step in immediately. So you have to realize, when we talk about divine intervention then, what level of danger are we in as a species right now? So I'll give you a few examples, like from physics, for instance. I believe that extraterrestrials only stepped in when the fabric of space-time was in danger of being ripped. And that happened in the first atomic bomb was not dropped on the 6th of August in 1945 in Hiroshima. It was dropped in the United States of America, in New Mexico, on the 16th of July in 1946. And they called it a test, is ingenuous at least, because it was a real bomb. It was exactly the same bomb. It was a plutonium bomb. They dropped two different kinds of bomb in Japan. August the 6th in Hiroshima was a uranium bomb. August the 9th in Nagasaki was a plutonium bomb. And the one that was dropped in New Mexico at the Trinity site was a plutonium bomb that created devastation. And that area still, the growth there is absolutely ludicrous. So it's interesting that took place on the 16th of July, 1945. Within 2 days, the first extraterrestrial crash happened in New Mexico and left debris there. And thereafter, we had Roswell happening in 1947, and then Kenneth Arnott actually was in July 1947. Roswell was July 1947, and since then there's been a plethora. Extraterrestrial forces have put our intercontinental atomic missiles off. They hovered on several occasions over Maelstrom Air Force Base in Montana and turned off 10 underground missiles from the air. In Russia, they turned on and they activated intercontinental ballistic missiles, which were nuclear, to demonstrate to the Russians and to us their capabilities. And the reason was, it wasn't just warning the finger, it was that a nuclear explosion literally damages the fabric of space-time. And so here was an extraterrestrial civilization, or maybe many, saying, okay, guys, that's a step too far. Yeah, it's not just kids playing with matches anymore. This is major, major stuff. And so they intervened. Now, so if the ETs would intervene and to make sure that maybe they're okay with us destroying the planet, but they're certainly not okay with us messing with space-time. That affects them as well. And so I believe absolutely that gods and angels, if we think about divine intervention coming directly from source or from angelic beings, that gods or angels only step in when the soul itself is in danger. The individual soul or the soul of the planet. And that short of that, it exercises the prime directive, because we're here to learn. And part of our learning is to learn from our mistakes. But if there were literally a danger to the soul, not just to the spacesuit, but if the soul itself were in danger of somehow eternally distancing or separating itself from source, then I totally believe that either source or angelic beings would intervene in a very significant, either personal or global level. Now, as I said before, sin means missing the mark, and it allows us to adjust our aim so that we can learn to grow. Perfection, my definition of perfection is that it comes from the Greek word telos, which means teleology. It means to be attracted towards a goal. And the realization is that we are as much products of our future as we are products of our past. If you have a mission to perform, or you have something you're really looking forward to, everything you do in the interim is predicated on what you're trying to achieve in the future. And so perfection literally means being committed to the mission for which you incarnated. No matter how many times I fall on my butt, no matter how many times I make mistakes, is picking myself back up again and saying, okay, I shake myself off and I'm going to try and realign myself with that mission. That's my definition of perfection. And my definition of happiness is that happiness is the occasional alignment with the mission. On those occasions in my life when I find myself fully in alignment with my purpose, then and only then am I a happy camper. And there's a huge difference, as I pointed out in this book, between pleasure, joy, and happiness. Happiness only comes when I'm in alignment with the mission. Now, I believe that enlightenment is the state of being in permanent alignment with the mission, not just occasional. If it's occasional, it's happiness. If it's permanent alignment, it's enlightenment. But enlightenment is like a slider switch. It's not binary, it's not on off. Either you're enlightened or you're not enlightened. It's not like that, it's a slider. You can increase the degree of luminosity by sliding the switch further up. And so when you meet these great avatars, you can realize sometimes, what degree of luminosity is shining through that avatar. How far up have they pushed the switch. And so I believe then that the interventions we've experienced in the past in the form of incarnated avatars were people like the Buddha or Jesus or the two Marys, Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Mary of Magdala, and that they came as exemplars. They didn't come to be worshipped. They came to tell us, you're as much God as I am God, or we are God. And here's an example of how you can find that inner divinity and model it and align with it, even in a space, or even as you're incarnated. So there are some of the ways. Then spiritual or mystical literature is a way in which we can kind of learn, or looking at the scriptural mystical traditions and realizing that they need to be updated and understood mystically. Realizing the difference between Atman and Jiva, the part of the soul that never leaves the source of God, and its constant communication with that part that volunteers for incarnation. And it happens through deja vu experiences, intuitive flashes, enlightenment, dreams, visions. And from us to them, it happens through prayer and meditation. And there's this notion within Catholicism, and I'll finish with this, what's called the communion of saints. Now, I think the communion of saints in Catholic theology uses very, very poor languaging. It talks about the church triumphant, which is those who've made it to heaven. And then the church suffering, which is those who are in purgatory. And then the church militant, which is us who are on planet Earth. Now, I disagree with the kind of the wordage of that, but the notion is really, really interesting. But here's my hit on what it really means. So if you're talking about heaven, purgatory, on earth, here are my definitions. Heaven is the higher self, the Atman, or the soul self, or the source self. So whenever a being is in contact with, or the presence of, and fully aligned with the soul self, or the higher self, you're actually in heaven. You're experiencing heaven on earth. You don't have to be out of the spacesuit before you can experience heaven. Christ said very famously, and his words are translated into Greek. It says, the kingdom of heaven is en mesoi in Greek. En mesoi in Greek means both within you and among you. So it's both a sociological phenomenon and an intrapsychic phenomenon. So when you realize, and when you're in contact with your soul self, or your source self, you're experiencing heaven right then. What is purgatory then? Purgatory for me is a level of the astral planes, the lower astral planes, where there are discombobulated, disincarnated souls. Those who've left the earth plane, but through fear or indoctrination or self-doubt, they're not moving towards the light. So they're hanging out in this space, and they're punishing themselves because of their thinking, their addictions, or their mindset. And so for me, that is what purgatory is about. And earth for me is, it's the scariest ride in the cosmic playground. God creates a playground, a cosmic playground, with all kinds of opportunities to experience apparent temporary separation from source. But some of these are pretty easy, and you can do it, with your eyes closed. And some of them are really scary. I believe that planet Earth, volunteering for planet Earth, is the scariest ride in the cosmos. Namaste, my brothers and sisters.
At the end there, you were bringing up heaven being both within and among. And maybe it'd been my exposure to you, but in one of my prayers each morning, I always say to experience that the kingdom of heaven is within, between, beyond, and the beyond within. And so that what we're gifted with is to be able to experience it within. And then when we're breaking bread together, sharing WWG here on Wednesdays or anytime, that's between. But the beyond is, that might be a best way to look at that as what's Rudolf Steiner, that they have a certain plane where that consciousness is. And then bringing that down to our level. It's within, between, beyond, and the beyond within. We have that ability to bring that level of consciousness within ourselves. Would you expand on that, what I've shared?
I love the prayer that you came up with. It actually reminds me of it's called the breastplate of St. Patrick, a famous prayer of St. Patrick, which says, Christ be before me, Christ be behind me, Christ be above me, Christ be below me, Christ be within me, Christ be without me, Christ be in the mouth of everyone who speaks to me or speaks about me, Christ be in the eyes of everyone who looks at me. So it's the very same thing. There is no place you can go where God is not. There is no place you can go where the divine is not present. There is no situation in which I find myself in which God is not a participant or available. And so you're absolutely right. Your prayer is really, really beautiful. And so it's only a question then of the level of awareness. As Michael mentioned, I had a dream a few months ago, and I like to seed my dreams before I go to sleep at night. I like to kind of raise a question and ask, the higher self or God or angelic beings or my guardians to kind of give me some insight about it. So I asked for a definition of consciousness. And I woke up with this very succinct definition that said, consciousness is source saturated self-awareness. And so what I see is there are levels and levels of awareness. An oak tree has a level of awareness. It's able to mine the ground for nutrients. It's able to mine the sun for chlorophyll. Animals, have a level of self-awareness. They're able to escape their predators. They're able to mate and reproduce themselves. Human beings have a level of awareness, but for a lot of us, our level of awareness is, kind of confined to a kind of the notion of a skin-encapsulated ego. I think I am what lies within this kind of epidermis of myself. Or at some stage, I begin to think I am my emotions, or to think that I am the relationships of which I'm a part, or to think that I am the profession that I have. And we're none of those things, of course. These are all just artifacts of the spacesuit. We come into a spacesuit that has 4 characteristics. It has physicality, it has emotionality, it has intellectuality, and it has personality. But they're artifacts of the spacesuit. They're not artifacts of the soul, any more than kind of the helmet or the gloves that Neil Armstrong was wearing on the moon were part of Neil Armstrong. There were things he needed to be on the moon. When he came back, he got rid of them. And so when we're in the spacesuits, the job is to try to remember that I have to distinguish between the artifacts of the spacesuit and the realization of who I really am and who the other is. And so in creating a cosmology, I advocate that people ask 4 different questions. First question, who is God? What do I mean when I say God? Second question is, who am I? What do I mean by I? Thirdly, what do I mean by neighbor? And fourthly, what do I mean by mission? And on the basis of answering those 4 questions, we start putting together a cosmology for ourselves. And if we learn to answer those questions well, we come up exactly with what your prayer is saying. There is no place where God is not. No matter where you look, it is not important where you look, it's how you look. If I don't know how to look, I can look everywhere and find nothing. If I do know how to look, it doesn't matter where I look, I'll find everything. And that was the great notion. The Buddha's most famous homily was one time he's got a group of followers and he plucks a flower and he holds it aloft. Mm-hmm. And the group is watching. Okay, what are you going to say about that? Smile. Nothing. And then finally, one of the disciples exactly broke into a big smile. And the Buddha realized this guy got it. And this guy got it, if you can really see a flower, you see everything. Because as Thich Nhat Hanh said so beautifully, a flower is composed totally of non-flower elements. If you were to take away the rain and the sunshine and the nutrients in the soil and the wind, there would be no such thing as a flower. So everything that exists consists completely of that which does not exist. And so the Buddha would say very, very beautifully, emptiness is form and form is emptiness. In other words, emptiness is the fertile womb out of which all possibilities emerge. And all manifest reality is the fruit of that womb. And so emptiness is form because it can produce everything. And form is emptiness because you can't mistake the form for the reality of what lies within. So I love again at your prayer, as the realization then that when you know how to look, then it doesn't matter where you look. You're going to see everything where you look.
I did do the exercise, the Rivers of Life, the 7-year exercise. And so my question is, I did it really quickly. I put major events and then what I learned. And like, for example, so for the lessons, I put what I learned. So I don't know if I did that correctly, because like when you think of a lesson, you think of some kind of, spiritual lesson. I mean, I sort of think of spiritual lessons, but I just did it very kind of matter of factly. So for example, like if I was abused as a child, what I learned is that I trust no one, that, no one is to be trusted. That's like something I learned. So if I'm doing the exercise and I write that down, is that okay? Or am I doing the exercise incorrectly?
You're absolutely doing it correctly. Then, as I said, what is the meaning of these experiences? And as I said, there are false meanings and there are true meanings. The true meaning is going to bring you into alignment with your mission. And so if I'm abused as a child and what it teaches me, don't trust anybody, that's a false meaning being assigned to the lesson. The true lesson may have been, learn to be self-sufficient, develop your skill set. It's not about not trusting others, it's about learning to trust yourself. And so you have to be able to harvest every situation for growth, not for kind of closing oneself off. So you have to be very important then that the meaning you assign to the mission, to the lesson, is actually bringing you into alignment with the purpose for which you volunteered. Yeah.
So I liked the idea of archetypes and complexes. And I was just wondering if there was a similar connection there between ideals and values, and if you could work with the archetypes and complexes in a similar way.
Right on. You're absolutely right, Robbie. So I mentioned that as a footnote last Sunday, but I didn't develop it. So I'm glad you gave me the opportunity. And so everywhere, there's the ideal form of everything, and then there's the manifested, less than perfect version of everything. And I gave examples last Sunday, for instance, like even in geometry, if you study Pythagoras and Plato and put them together, the idea, there's an ideal circle, which is in which every point of the circumference is equidistant from the center, but it isn't possible to reproduce a perfect circle. If you take a compass or a protractor, or a stick in the ground, you're not going to create a perfect circle. And so the archetype is the ideal circle, and the complex is the less than perfect version. I gave the example of a mother and child, the archetype of mother and the complex of mother. So I love to put together, for instance, Plato and Pythagoras. They're basically around the same period of time. Plato's notion of the ideal realm, in which the forms are absolutely perfect, but they cannot be produced, in incarnation. And so I gave the example from Pythagoras of a perfect circle. Ideally, there's a perfect circle, a two-dimensional object in which every point on the perimeter is equidistant from the center of it. But you can't reproduce that in real life. Even with a compass or a projector, if you try to create a perfect circle, there'll be micromuscular movements that will kind of waver a little bit. It may be even undetectable visually, but it'll be there. Or you're drawing it on paper, which is, the fabric of the paper isn't consistent, and there are going to be dips and rises. And so you can't produce a perfect circle. So the ideal circle is the archetype of the circle, and the kind of the drawn circle is the complex that arises. I gave the example a while ago of the mother archetype versus the mother complex. The mother archetype is what the child expects to find when he comes in, and the mother complex is the woman he actually finds when he does arrive. Now, so we get that again and again and again. And so the very same thing happens with mission. The archetype of mission imprinted on the soul is what I would call in this book, the ideals. And the complex is the way we actually live out and the compromises we make with our own ideals, because that's how we've been educated, or that's how what we see modeled for us in society. That's what we're programmed to do. So there's this big gap between the values by which we actually live and the ideals by which we think we should be living. And I said in that book that the major mission of every human being is to shrink the gap between the values and the ideals. In other words, to try to map the values onto the archetypes, because the values only come because of incarnational programming from parents and from teachers.
Seán, you had mentioned that if we had time, you would talk about apoptosis.
So this is a subject that I spoke about several, maybe months ago, weeks ago, in one of the homilies. So apoptosis is basically the biological system whereby cells are programmed to die and be replaced by fresh cells. And if it doesn't happen, cancers develop. And so, for instance, when a little embryo is developing, in utero, it has webbed fingers and webbed feet, because it's basically, it's a marine creature. And so at some stage before it's born, those particular cells have to die off. So that when it's born, it's a land animal. It also has a kind of vestigial tail when it's born. We call it the coccyx. And so evolutionarily speaking, the entire species has come from marine. When you look, for instance, embryologically, at every infant in the womb, has at some stage of its evolution, it has webbed fingers, literally webbed fingers and webbed toes, because we come from a marine background. And so we got vestiges of our entire evolutionary trajectory. We started off as marine creatures. The first life forms were single-celled amoebas in the oceans, and then multicellular organisms. And then they came onto land as amphibians. And so, we still have vestigial traces of that past. Now, once we've been born, the body is programmed to kill off cells and replace them on a regular basis. And if we don't do that, cancers develop. And so, for instance, every single month, you're going to shed every single skin cell in your body. In fact, 50% of the dust in your home is dead skin cells. Now, if you didn't do that, you'd be a rotting corpse, a walking, rotting corpse. So it is programmed in, cells have to die and replace themselves. Every single cell in your stomach lining gets replaced on a 6-week cycle. Every cell in your skeletal system gets replaced on a 6-month cycle. And every cell in your entire body gets replaced on a 7-year cycle. Now, when groups of cells declare their independence and refuse to let go and die, they create tumors, which are cancerous. And they kill the host and therefore kill themselves as well. So it's a murder-suicide pact that these renegades, are creating. So apoptosis then is vitally important embryologically and biologically, but I claim as well that it is true sociologically and spiritually. So sociologically, what do I mean? It means that as a human species, we need to kind of evolve different methods of self-governance. And so we started off as nomadic pastoralists, little groups of 15 to 40 people wandering around, in Southern Africa and East Africa. And there was a method of self-government which was appropriate for bands of 15 to 40 people. And then with the horticultural revolution 12,000 years ago, and particularly with the agricultural revolution 5,000 years ago, as we began to live in bigger and bigger cities, self-governance became a much bigger problem. And so now you had the notion of, so I started off talking about, kind of nomadic pastoralists in South Africa, which are typically, there were groups of 50 to 40 nomads. And so self-governance was very, very easy. Then with the advent of horticulture 12,000 years ago, and particularly with agriculture, the difference between horticulture and agriculture is just a digging stick. Agriculture is the ox-drawn plow. So it's a very different beast. Now with the advent of agriculture and big cities, you get theocracies where the law of God is imposed on people politically and sociologically, and the churches tend to have jurisdiction over your physical life and your afterlife. So that kind of tyranny. And then you have the tyranny of monastic bloodlines, so what I'm looking for, kingly bloodline. And so at that stage then, self-government is a much, much more complex phenomenon. And so it becomes really, really important then, how we determine what systems need to change and die. So we were talking about apoptosis. So sociologically, particular styles of government and self-government need to die off and be replaced by more judicious and loving and compassionate versions of self-government. And that may be in smaller groupings, not at a global level, but a kind of a globe filled with villages like neurons on a cosmic brain. But there definitely needs to be a totally different system of self-government, politically, economically, educationally, medically, religiously. And so apoptosis needs to happen sociologically, and it needs to happen spiritually as well. The apoptosis of letting go of previous cosmologies and previous kind of affiliations with kind of more fundamentalist thinking in order to embrace more mystical, esoteric, source-based systems. So that's what I mean by apoptosis, embryologically, biologically, sociologically, and spiritually.
The masculine and the feminine, and thinking about that, that being is feminine, doing is masculine, knowing is masculine, experiencing is feminine. The way is feminine, pointing the way is masculine. Intelligence is feminine, and intellect is masculine. I feel that we need that reemergence of the fullness of the feminine, and that's what I've sensed coming through you. You care to comment on that? I know it's late.
I did actually an entire retreat either 2 years ago or 3 years ago on, I call it spirituality beyond gender. And so I believe that there are several stages to the process, Bob. We certainly very definitely and very immediately need the kind of resurgence of the feminine face of God. But I prefer to think actually beyond gender differences into what I would call the yin and the yang, because the males need to develop, feminine characteristics, and females need to develop male characteristics. So we're meant to grow into the fullness of the image of God, not just into one articulation. And then, so I prefer to speak about yin energies and yang energies, because sometimes men can demonstrate yin energies and women need to demonstrate yang energies. So I don't want to just get caught up with the gender split. I want to go to yin and yang. And then finally, I want to go beyond even yin and yang. So that's what I gave a whole retreat. If you check my homilies page, 2 years ago or 3 years ago, I did 6 lectures on spirituality beyond gender, a place where even the yin and the yang is meaningless because we're so bathed in source itself that to make any kinds of